We speak about the occupation of Palestine. This is actually a wrong term. It's not an occupation. An occupation is a temporary control of a land by a foreign power. It's temporary, it's military occupation. The Japanese occupied Malaya. The Japanese occupied Singapore. But they did not occupy Taiwan. They colonized Taiwan. It's a permanent thing. It involves settlement of the foreign power, development of institutions, and so on and so forth. Israel is not an occupying force. Palestine is colonized by Israel since 1948. And by now, there are 3 forms of colonization that are taking place in Israel. It's sort of insulting to keep referring to the occupation because you're minimizing. I know in our minds we are not minimizing it, but let us use the correct terminology and not simply use the terminology that is sold to us by the Western media and also adopted by our own media.
We finally enter our final panel of distinguished scholars. I'm going to introduce the panelists in the order that they will go, inshallah, in the order that we happen to be sitting, starting with Dr. Syed Farid al-Attas, who is a professor of sociology at the National University of Singapore. He headed the Department of Malay Studies from 2007 until 2013. He lectured at the University of Malaya in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies prior to joining NUS. Professor al-Attas has authored numerous books and articles, including Ibn Khaldun, published by Oxford University Press in 2013, Applying Ibn Khaldun, The Recovery of a Lost Tradition in Sociology, published in 2014, or co-authored, and Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, published in 2017. His new book on the decolonization of knowledge from the Malay world is forthcoming in 2025, inshallah. His areas of interest are the sociology of Islam, social theory, religion and reform, intra- and interreligious dialogue, and the study of Eurocentrism. Next, we'll have Dr. Ashwak Hauter, who is an assistant professor of medical anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I guess medical anthropology means that if an anthropology is sick, she's the one to see. She is the author of Fright and the Fraying of Community, Medicine, Borders, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, published in Cultural Anthropology 2023, and Madness, Pain, and Ikhtilat al-Aql, conceptualizing Ibn Abi Sadiq's medico-philosophical psychology, published in 2020. She holds a PhD in medical anthropology and an MA in anthropology, both from the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Dr. Khairudin Aljunied, to my left, is an associate professor at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, also at National University of Singapore. His primary area of specialization is on the social and intellectual history of Islam in Southeast Asia. Dr. Aljunied published several essays on the themes of Orientalism and colonialism, and more recently on cosmopolitanism and reformism in Islam. Among his publications are a number of books, including Islam in Malaysia, An Entwined History, 2019, Hamka and Islam, Cosmopolitan Reform in the Malay World, 2018, Muslim Cosmopolitanism, Southeast Asian Islam in Comparative Perspectives, 2016, and Radicals, Resistance and Protest in Colonial Malaya, 2015. Then my good friend Dr. Jonathan Brown, who is the Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He received his doctorate in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago in 2006. His book publications include The Canonization of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, The Formation and Function of the Sunni Canon, published in 2007, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, alayhi salam, published by One World in 2009 and second edition in 2017. Muhammad, A Very Short Introduction, alayhi salam, Oxford University Press, 2011. And then Misquoting Muhammad, the challenges and choices of interpreting the Prophet's legacy, alayhi salam, One World, 2014. And finally, we're going to run out of time. Slavery and Islam, 2019. Dr. Brown's current research interests include Islamic legal reform and a translation of Sahih al-Bukhari. He's also the director of research at the Yaqeen Institute. Look, this is a little outdated, but you're almost that. Anyway, that's fine. And finally, my dear friend and teacher, Dr. Jasser Auda, who is a scholar of global prominence. He's the president of Maqasid Institute, an international network of research centers and educational projects, professor and al-Shatibi chair of Maqasid Studies at the International Peace College in South Africa, and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Contemporary Maqasid Studies, member of the European Council for Fatwa and Research, FIG Council of North America, and the International Union of Muslim Scholars. Dr. Auda holds a PhD in philosophy of Islamic law from the University of Wales, PhD in systems analysis from the University of Waterloo, and Allahul Musta'an. Early in his life, he memorized the Quran, and now he is doing something that is the dearest to my heart. I have to say this because the passion with which he speaks of the Quran and tafsir has inspired me, and so he's working on a multi-volume tafsir, and I am excited to read that, inshallah. So, without further ado, Professor al-Attas.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are given just a few minutes to offer some comments on the discussions during the last couple of days, I think. And so I actually prepared to speak for about 20 minutes, half an hour, before I was told that we have 5 to 7 minutes. So what I'm going to do is to just pick on a couple of issues which I think are important. Now, this whole idea of speaking about the problems of the Muslim world and talking in a strategic manner about what can be done, what plans are to be made, what programs are to be put in place, is of course something very important. It does require a proper analysis of where we are now, what the problems are today, and how did we arrive at these problems. And I think one issue that has actually not been discussed is the nature of our political economy today. We seem to take it for granted that the current system works. And I'm talking about capitalism. And, to make a long story short, the system we live in today is a very abnormal system. Because of our socialization, we take it to be normal. What is abnormal about the system? For most of human history, people did not live in a way that they have no access to land. The system today is such that a tiny percentage of the world, 2%, 3%, owns capital, controls capital. The rest of humanity has to work without any ownership of anything. They work for salaries, or most of humanity works for wages, weekly or daily wages. This is a very abnormal or strange system if you look at it from the point of view of the history of humanity, where for the most of human history, people had the rights to work on land. They had access. There was no ownership of land. There were very few places around the world in pre-modern times where you could actually buy land. But people had the right to use land. The system that we have now is therefore quite strange, if you look at it from a historical perspective. It is a system that again, to cut a long story short, roughly began with it began with the age of colonization, with the conquest of America by the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the Italians. So capitalism started with, during the colonial period. 1492 is the beginning of European colonization. Now, what is important to understand about colonial capitalism is that it was entangled with racism and misogyny and slavery. And we have inherited that legacy. The downtrodden, the oppressed of the world today, migrant laborers, for example, migrant labor generally consists of black and brown people around the world. Even in more developed countries in the south, like Malaysia, our migrant laborers come from the region or from South Asia, brown people. And forgive me for using these terms, but these are the terms that our racist discourse in the modern age has developed. So we don't have slavery anymore, in the sense that human beings are not commodified, but it is a kind of demeaning, forced, almost forced labor, and the treatment of migrant workers in Malaysia, in Singapore, in the Gulf is something that needs to be looked at very carefully. Now, but what I want to emphasize really are the extreme inequalities. The extreme inequalities in our system. Are we saying that we tolerate these extreme inequalities? You have a tiny percentage of the world owns capital that makes offensively, obscenely, large profits, incomes, salaries, profits, dividends, bonuses, and the gulf between them and the rest of humanity, particularly 40, 50%, 60% working class people and peasants who live from from paycheck to paycheck, as it were, or even, not even that. We're talking about large-scale poverty. There's something wrong with the system, capitalism. Islamic economics as a field does not have a concept of exploitation. We have been talking, in many forums, we talk about the problem of the Ummah, taking for granted that the system we are working under is capitalism, and not talking about reform, whether it is possible to reform capitalism, or is it actually necessary to dismantle the system. The problem with the dominant ideology, the Eurocentric ideology, is that it presents capitalism as normal and as the end game, so-called end of history. And we are not encouraged to think of alternatives. The decolonization, the decolonial discourse, of course, encourages us to think of decolonial options beyond socialism and capitalism. But to the extent that Eurocentrism dominates our curricula, we're not able to think that way. I want to, I just have, I think, 2 minutes left. This leads me to my next point, which is whether we actually have the ability to think about these problems in a deep manner. And I'm speaking not about the US or Europe, about our situation in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in the Muslim world. We have very bad universities. We have terrible universities. Although in Malaysia we probably have among the best in the Muslim world, but even our universities are in very bad state. We suffer from low academic standards. We suffer from excessive bureaucracy, far more than we have in other universities. We suffer from unethical practices, which are widespread in our universities. I'll give you one example. and some of you from abroad, you may be shocked by this, every PhD student in the local Malaysian universities and state universities, in order to graduate, are forced to co-author, I think, 2 or 3 papers. Those of you who know in the audience, you can correct me. I think at least 2 papers must be published in a journal and co-authored with a supervisor. They are forced. This is completely unethical. In many cases, the supervisor doesn't even do the work in terms of the co-authoring, actually co-authoring, right? This is just one of the examples of unethical practices, not to mention the larger problem of low academic standards. And you can't expect, research of high standard to come out of such institutions. And indeed, I will even claim that our universities have gone down so much that even in the field of Malay studies, Malaysia does not lead the discourse in the world, does not define the discourse in the world. The previous generation perhaps, but not the current generation of scholars. And the situation in other universities in the Muslim world is much worse. It's much worse. And I just want to end with this point. The universities in the Muslim world are actually Christian universities. Even the Islamic universities. They are Christian universities. Now, what do I mean by that? In the early model of the university in the Muslim world in pre-modern times, the degree, what you call the degree, the ijazah, was given by the teacher directly. It was one-on-one, right? And in that system, there is no authority that governs the institution. No authority decides on what can be taught, what cannot be taught. No authority could tell the teacher that you're not allowed to teach this book, you're not allowed to teach that book. Now this system, this idea of the university, of a degree-granting institution, it is well known, was adopted by the Europeans. Even the system of waqaf, which was the financial basis of the university, was adopted by the English. They call these waqaf charitable endowments, universities like Oxford and Cambridge. The difference is that this model was modified in such a way that the university, the degree, which they called licencia, or licence in French, which is the direct translation of ijazah, was issued by the church. And therefore the church was the authority, and the church could ban works, could decide on the curricula. And indeed the church did ban, from time to time, there were times when the church would ban certain books of Aristotle. I'm going to finish, 30 seconds. That function of the church was taken over by ministries of education in Europe. The universities we set up in the Muslim world, including the Islamic universities, are borrowed from the modified European tradition of the early Islamic model. So our degrees, our universities are set up by ministries of education. The authorities are the Ministry of Education, and the ministries of education in most of our countries, which are not democratic countries, decide on the curricula, ban works, ban professors from teaching, in the best of cases, but also put people in jail for saying certain things. Now, in such a situation in the Muslim world, where we have low standard universities, I don't think there's even one university that is world class in the Muslim world, and with a lack of academic freedom, how are we going to do the serious work of thinking about the future of the Muslim world? So reform of universities is of utmost importance. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I just want to thank the organizers for putting this together. You've done a tremendous amount of work and labor, and I really appreciate it. So someone asked a question yesterday about what I would consider local histories, like past injustices and trauma, and then they also mentioned something about indigenous knowledge, and so this kind of fueled what I'm about to reflect upon. And it's kind of in line with what Professor al-Attas is talking about, which is pedagogy. As a medical and psychological anthropologist, much of my work is historical, in a sense that I want to understand the echoes in people's reflection of their history, of their contemporary practices. but it is mainly contemporary as I trace the frameworks of what constitutes the ideas of participants in my study. What I've been studying in the last decade is how patients conceive of afia and who and what will secure it. What constitutes the question of the unity of the Ummah was always raised. When patients spoke about their inability to desire or imagine a future, it was always in relation to the tenuous relationship to their family, to their community, to the Muslim Ummah. This echoes what Imam Umar Sulaiman mentioned regarding the individual, that the individual's well-being will always be what I consider a question of relationality, rather than something interior. My reflections on Ummatic unity has to do with methods and the kind of methods by which we come to understand what constitutes an Ummatic subject and how the cultivation of that Ummatic subject is dependent on the larger Ummah and community. Afia is a relational concept. Your physical, psychic, and spiritual well-being is dependent on the foundational science of what constitutes the material, spiritual body and its relation to its soul, that soul to a history, that soul to a family, and that family to a larger socioeconomic and political apparatus, and the desires that circulate within it. So when we try to study illness, well-being, or repair from past violence and disunity, we must have the tools that can equip us to do so. So we must not only delve into our traditions to reformulate frameworks of the self and the collective, but also consider what is the foundation of our knowledge. How do we come to understand afia? And also, what are the local histories at play that have contributed to repeated violence? What would an Ummatic repair look like? It can be anything from who is imagined to be part of the Ummah, and to what kind of conceptualization of the self secures a soul that is content, and how might the law be integral to securing afia itself? I will give an example. Historically, melancholia was considered an excess of black bile, and as a result of a weak soul. It is diagnosed by depressive feelings and treated through bloodletting and exercise and uplifting music sometimes. Now, it's not historically linear that we now say we must understand depressive states this way. However, if we read Fanon's writing on Algerians' mental illness during the French settler colonialism, he traces the symptoms of depersonalization, which is a psychiatric diagnosis of experiencing detachment from oneself's feelings and emotions and society in general. Fanon would treat these patients, but once they re-emerged in society, their estrangements would return, because they were permanently an alien in their own country. He considers this a return to a culture in agony and in ruins. When I spoke to patients in hospitals, they would speak about their ill states as their souls being knotted or mu'taqid. Historically and through repetitions of violence, of mistrust within communities, but they will also invoke modern psychological concepts such as lack of desire for food, insomnia, depression, hopelessness. They will speak about their soul's waning desire, their heart's taintedness. And even though they will invoke ego psychology, their symptoms are always in relation to their soul, a particular history, and the Ummah that they feel is lacking. I have two more examples. So my first example actually comes from Professor Brown. I was a student of his back in 2018, and he actually asked me on the bus, if I remembered that he asked me this question. He was like, Ashwak, you're a medical anthropologist. Do jinn exist in the West? And I think at the time I said, yes, they do. The jinn exists in the West. So jinn possessions. As a medical anthropologist who works on Islam and the Middle East, everyone wants to ask me about jinn possessions. Always jinn possessions. And I kind of resist that question, but I'll entertain it for this reason. So jinn involved the possession or the enactment of possession. So it involves envy and individual wishing you harm. It involves the question of evil. And it's not just necessarily the presence of an informal force or a cultural idiom for a mental illness, but it involves the lack of trust circulating within the community. It is also explained as a consequence of a weak soul. And the question is not so much, does it exist, does it not exist? Because we know that the evil eye is real, and the Prophet ﷺ said, al-'aynu haqq, right? But how it circulates, and what are the conditions that proliferate it? So what are the frameworks of the soul that it invokes? And how can we actually use afia to understand it and understand its proliferation? And this is a better approach than what most Muslim scholars try to understand they call it like the cultural diagnosis of mental illness. Because it's trying to stigmatize like a medical condition that they find is immaterial. So we must, I have one more example, but I don't know if I have time. Do I have time? 1 minute. Oh, 1 minute. Okay, then I will conclude. So I have another example. You can ask me about it in the quick Q&A. So we must trace these grammars in order to better equip ourselves with tools to better examine illnesses, in order to cultivate an ummatic subject that secures afia. Therefore, how can we then delve into our tradition to equip ourselves with not simply practices, but reformulate frameworks that views the human as a relational being that has a family, community, and also is considered a successor of God? The law here then becomes an important figure in our very formulation of, say, medicine or psychology or mental health that is not just simply left to human reason, but we must also understand how these very frameworks will give us insights into the phrase within the community that hinder ummatic solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sticking to very strict regimen here, but I have a very unpleasant job. So, inshallah, Professor Aljunied.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I understand because everybody's sleeping, so I'm going to wake you up a little bit. I'll stick to the time. I've been in the army before, so I'll stick to the time religiously. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Distinguished guests, respected speakers, friends, and enemies. I want to begin with a very high note, and I think Jack or Jonathan Brown and Professor Jasser Auda will deliberate on what I'm going to talk about. And I want to make the point, in the course of the 2 days that we have had our discussions, that we are already in the age of Ummatic revival. And this is the first point that I want to underline. And I'm not saying this because I am a Muslim or that I believe in Ummatic revival. I'm saying it as a historian of Islam who also studies other traditions. And we can read the works of Georgetown scholar Jose Casanova, who talks about the rise of public religions, Peter Berger, a sociologist, a macro-sociologist, who talks about the desecularization of the world, Jürgen Habermas, who's now pro-Israel, sadly, who talks about the rise of what he calls as post-secularism. So without a doubt, we are already in the cups, in the zenith of an Ummatic revival. With or without the Ummatics project, the Ummah will revive itself. And we need to recognize this. We need to be at the forefront of a new normal that is in the air, and we must train our eyes and our consciousness to recognize first this fact, because Muslims are going to be back. Right? Yeah, I wasn't hoping for an applause, but I'm saying this really from a purely historicist and historical perspective. Now, all of this is well and fine, that yeah, we are in a revival, but there are many tensions. And And I think Professor al-Attas was trying to deliberate on one of these tensions, and our second speaker was talking about issues of medical and other things. But I want to put a bit of emphasis in the few minutes that I have. I actually prepared for 70 minutes, but I'm given 7, of 3 key tensions that the Ummatics collective must take note of. And these tensions are at the level of ideational, practical, and spiritual. And the last one is the more important tension that we need to take note of. At the ideational level, the Ummah is in the face of the tension between absolutism and cosmopolitanism. We must recognize that a lot of Muslims are getting more and more absolutist. Whether they say that they are on or in for this Ummatic project, they only see things from their own small micro point of view. And this is one of the stumbling blocks of us reaching to the unity that we envision for. And in one of my books, as mentioned just now by Professor Ovamir, I talk about the importance of this cosmopolitan tendency, where in the Quran, Allah says very clearly in Surah Al-Hujurat, Inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uba wa qabaila lita'arafu. The key word there is really lita'arafu, to know one another, to respect one another, to accept that we are plural in the very existence as a human being, and to accept others amongst us. So that is the first. I have 2 other points within the ideational thing, and I will send it to Ummatics for them to consider. But within the ideational tension is the issue of conformity versus criticality. Here in Southeast Asia, hasbuna ma wajadna alaihi aba'ana. Everything we do, we refer back to what our ancestors have done, which is good. But even in the negative practices in our society, we depend on the adat. We depend on practices that are outmoded in our community. I was teaching in the University of Malaya and had the experience of living in Brunei. Criticality is the one trait that is lacking in Southeast Asian Muslims and lacking as a whole in the Ummah. And we need to resolve this tension between conformity and criticality. So that's the first. But what do we do then? That leads me to the second point, the practical point that we need to consider before we enter into the realm of the spiritual. The problem that we have right now in the Ummah is this tension between the elitists or elitism and populism. And we have heard a lot of these populist politics that are raging right now in America, in Europe, and elsewhere. The big mistake that the Ummatics collective and the Ummah will commit is to become totally elitist or totally populist. And we need to find this balance of not going up there and being too highly philosophical, such that we don't resolve the problems of poverty, the problems of the du'afa, the problems of the people who are poor on the ground. And we commit the second mistake of becoming too populist, that we talk about things only from the point of view of the small man down there. So that's the second tension. When we think about policies of the future, we need to find a balance between the two. Now, to find that balance, we need to also overcome the issue of local rivalries versus global solidarity. You don't have to go far. Live in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, everywhere in Southeast Asia. After this conference, people will hate each other. Am I correct? So all talk goes down the drain because the very Muslim that you are trying to address is the very Muslim that will bring you down. Why? Because of one issue, personality. And this is our problem as an ummah, that at the end of the day, the local rivalries always trump over the talk about global solidarity. And I have 2 more minutes. Why are these 2 problems seemingly insoluble, or you cannot resolve it? The real issue, Inna Allaha la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. Again, the key word there is the nufus, the nafs. And here I want to end with the spiritual problem that we don't talk about in the last 2 days. A little bit by our Sheikh Sami. It was quite an animated discussion. We have in this Ummah the problem of the spiritual. And that's why I wrote the book, Sufism in Southeast Asia, Dialogue and Tradition Across Southeast Asia, to say that one big problem that we have, and I want to make it a point today for everyone to hear and bring it back to Singapore, is the tension between hypocrisy and sincerity. That hypocrisy has become the normal in the Muslim community, in the Ummah. That people can put mask after mask after mask until the mask becomes the face. And they forget what is their actual face. And we have this, the mask that you see in the battle for Gaza, the mask that you see in the talk about OIC and the solidarities that we have been talking about. All of this lies in the problem of spirituality that we have in our Ummah. And to overcome this problem, we go back to Al-Ghazali, who talks about the tension between khawf and between raja, between fear and hope. The only way for this Ummah to change the ideational, the practical, and the spiritual problem is for us to remove the fear in our hearts that the Ummah cannot be revived. Because the West, the Western sociologists, anthropologists, whatever scholar that you have out there, can see that this Ummah was an Ummah of courage, that they are courageous enough to build themselves again from the ashes, and they will do it again. So we need to come out of this, and then this Ummatic project, to my mind, in my humble opinion, will become a reality. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Thanks a lot for inviting me, Ovamir, and it's nice to see all of you. And I just wanted to start with the point that Ovamir made earlier about making babies as an accomplishment. That was a very good point. But it's a lot of times the things that we don't think about or that we take for granted are actually our greatest strengths. Parenting is difficult, as you said. I mean, it's really, I never thought about that. I mean, like Palestinian parenting and family unity, I mean, there's a lot of parts of the world, in the United States, for example, where just family, the integrity of the family has broken down, and that's the biggest problem that it prevents any further development. So it's really interesting to think about, like, just how, if we can have our families survive, that's a real accomplishment. Passion is an accomplishment. Passion is an asset. It's a blessing, right? If Muslims have been beaten down for 150 years at least. Their states have been broken up. Their movements have been crushed. Their aspirations have been denied over and over and over again for no reason other than it presents the possibility of Muslim unity and power, right? So you think in the 2000s, there was this thing called the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia, which was literally just a bunch of Muslim scholars who were like, we need to not have a war, civil war anymore. We just want to have peace and order. That's all we want. And there was essentially an American and Ethiopian cooperation to invade and destroy that, which amongst other things led to al-Shabaab. But why did they destroy that? Just because it was Muslim, literally just because it was Muslims organizing on the basis of their religion, it had to be destroyed, right? So, and I think that a lot of people, certainly, I mean, I've felt this a lot, like since the kind of failure of the Arab Spring, just like this sense of defeat, of like Muslim defeat. Oh, it's like, again, failure, again, defeat. And there was, I think, a strong sense in certainly like maybe Western public discourse that, now like Islamism is dead, right? So now Muslims are no longer motivated by their religion anymore. They're not idealistic, they're cynical just like us. They're not willing to sacrifice, they're consumerists just like us, right? They don't have any notion of Ummatic unity, they're just interested in the nation state just like us. So finally, we've won, they've also realized this is the end of history. But that's not true. I mean, that's and one of the things that has been so inspiring about the world since the Gaza genocide started is seeing how not true that was. Like seeing how passionate Muslims still are, seeing how much love and sympathy they have for their fellow Muslims, even though they're thousands and thousands of miles away. Seeing solidarity, right? Seeing governments that had thought that they were able to manipulate their citizens with just, TVs and lattes and things like that, that actually people want more than that they have ideals, that they have love for fellow Muslims, right? And I think that this is really important to remember. And I also will just make the second point, which is to really think about Gaza as an inflection point. And I think I hesitate to make predictions, but I'm certainly not the first person to say this, right? I think we'll look back on this Gaza episode as an inflection point in history. I think this is a very important point. I hope I'm right? Because not only has the utter moral hypocrisy of Western countries, the utter undisguisable, revolting hypocrisy of these countries been laid bare, and it's been made undeniable. It's been made undeniable, right? Not only has that happened, but also you've seen instances of, for lack of a better word, ummatic motivation and action, right? So there'll never be change unless people are willing to sacrifice. And the kind of Western consumer capitalist vision for the end of history is that people will never sacrifice because they just want lattes and they just want to sit and watch TikTok videos. And as long as they can do that, they won't care about anything else. And they won't ever do anything because no one will be willing to lose those things or give those things up for other people. But what you see in Yemen is people who are willing to sacrifice, right? They're willing to sacrifice, and that terrifies everybody who had thought they had lulled kind of the Muslim world into kind of placated consumerist existence. And look, and somebody, I thought, should I mention the Houthis? Maybe someone's going to get upset. But you know what? Get over it, people. Get over, but they're Shia. But Iran. Get over it. Everybody has beefs. Everybody has resentments. Everybody's been wronged by somebody. Everybody has grievances. But keep your grievances in perspective. If you just want to sit and wallow in your own grievance, I'm not talking about you particularly, I'm talking about a lot of Muslims around the world. If you just want to sit around and wallow in your own grievance and how you've been wronged, you're not going to accomplish anything. And you're never going to be able to have solidarity with other people. So we need to keep our particular, I have grievances, right? I don't want them to prevent me from building something greater. And I think this is very important to keep in mind. Jazakumullah khair.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In the minutes I have, let me greet you for this very important project. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you all the tawfiq in building all your aspirations for the Ummatic studies. Let me suggest in the few minutes I have that you combine working within the paradigm that is probably important for logistical reasons and media reasons with working outside the paradigm, because you cannot really have Ummatic studies within a paradigm that is not Ummatic, that is not Islamic. So the paradigm that we have is contrary to the Quranic view. The political paradigm, the economic paradigm, the way we approach psychology, architecture, engineering, the way we approach sciences and knowledge, and therefore build institutions and education and reality on the ground, is largely not Islamic if you take a Quranic worldview. The Quranic worldview to the capitalist economy that Prof talked about is contrary to the basics of the capitalist economy. The Islamic worldview deals with rizq, not mal, and deals with awqaf as the main institutions in societies rather than buying and selling people's health and life and education and so forth. The Islamic approach to economics, coming from كي لا يكون دولة بين الأغنياء منكم, so it's not circulating, wealth is not circulating only amongst the rich, is contrary to the current economic paradigm from the top to all the details. And therefore, while we are dealing with an approach for the Ummah within the paradigm, we should start to do some basic research on how to rebuild ourselves outside the capitalist paradigm. The political paradigm is the same. There is the 1% in the capitalist paradigm and the 1% white supremacist kind of approach to governing international affairs that is actually ruling the international system. And yes, we can work within the nation states and try to build alliances and try to push some good and some decent people within the current systems, but we also have to address the bigger problem of the current white supremacy empire and its tools that it is using around the world. Israel is a tool, the hypocrite governments in the Arab world is a tool, and so forth. And therefore, you are really looking at a different paradigm when you deal with politics to grow into taking over, dealing from within the paradigm. And you can talk the same way about the other sciences. And I would even say that we need to go beyond the academic disciplinization of the current sciences under the humanities, natural, social, and applied sciences into a different approach to knowledge altogether that is based on dealing with phenomena, dealing with reality, rather than dealing with a hypothesized economics that do not exist and is pushing the reality based on a myth. And hypothesized political science, international relation, that does not exist in the reality, but it's a myth that is actually a tool of trying to push the interests of the 1% in each of these different sciences. So how can we fund that and how can we popularize that? And these ideas are obviously not popular. Most humanity wants to live comfortably and they want their norms and they don't want critical approaches. I think we need to look for the researchers and the students of knowledge who are the minority of the minority, but they are willing to research such topics, and to look for the organizations, also the minority of the minority, that are willing to carry this topic. Jazakumullah khairan, barakallahu feekum, assalamu alaikum.